I'm Alan Simpson, and this is the fourth in the series of talks that I've done for Nottingham University on the climate emergency that we're currently immersed in. But let me just begin by recapping on the scale of the problems that we face before I get into the notion of the 15-minute city. Societies have actually come and gone. Towns, cities, cultures, civilizations have come to an end, and you read Jared Diamond's book on collapse as a really good summary of societies that have overconsumed the means and resources needed to survive. But this is the first time in human history when we have the prospects of obliterating ourselves, not as a culture or a country, but as a species. And that is because there's a huge disconnect between the realities of climate physics and the rate at which we are accelerating, causing the acceleration in climate change, and our ability to grasp the scale of changes in our own lifestyles that are needed to avoid that. The 15-minute city is a really useful concept that illustrates some of the confusion around the moment. And it's worth beginning with the controversy, because the far right are saying that the 15-minute city is essentially a totalitarian concept designed to control and constrain individual movements and individual freedoms. It's a notion designed to deliver the incarceration of communities in almost closed prison camp existences in the towns and cities in which they live. Actually, this is completely bonkers. And if there is anything that is the biggest obstacle in addressing the climate emergency, it is getting past the use of false news to confuse us. And this really is being used and manipulated to deliver social division rather than social intervention. And this goes from the notion of Bill Gates messing about with microparticles in vaccines so that he can monitor every time any of us pass wind. If society, if the big corporations want to control our social movements, there are all sorts of much easier, convenient legislative ways of doing so. But it isn't technology that is the imprisonment. It is the notion that unless we carry on this suicidal path, all is lost. And in fact, it's exactly the opposite. So turn the 15-minute city notion on its head. If you want to understand this, the best starting point is our parents or our grandparents, who understood that viable communities saw the existence of a multitude of local shops, local workshops, local factories, all of which gave localized access to the goods and services that kept the communities themselves intact. This was before those communities were stripped of locality-based services and became urban deserts with nothing that connected people together, and instead forced us all into this presumption that out of town everything was our salvation. And it's that nonsense that we have to turn back. So in many ways, the issue you could address is not from the starting point of sustainability, but you can do it much more simply from the notion of democracy and accountability. And that is where I think we have to link all three of those strands together. Democracy, accountability, and sustainability will all be part of a package that turns today's economics on its head. And this is where we need to look for really good examples of the changes that are in this direction that are already happening. Paris is a really good example on this. Paris has already cut the existence of its urban parking spaces in half. 70,000 car parking spaces have already been taken out. It has a program in which there'll be no diesel cars allowed in the city by 2024, no fossil fuel vehicles by 2030. And they already are pursuing an all-electric taxi fleet, and they have 50 kilometers of cyclist-only routes. And yet, if you look at the localities, certainly around the UK, that are attempting to go down that same path, the notion that we have restricted vehicle access to deliver clean air for our kids to grow up in, safe streets for them to play in, all of this is being redefined by the climate denying right as an intrusion on individual liberties, when the failure to intrude, disrupt, and change is going to be the downfall of us all. But Paris and other cities are showing exactly how you can make those transformations in ways that are not only sustainable, but deeply popular. Trams are another part of that process. Nottingham has a fantastic tram network. I love it, but it only has 2 routes. And in the time that it took for Nottingham to deliver those 2 routes, its twin city in Germany, Karlsruhe, had developed a whole city network. And the reason for this is that in the UK, local authorities are required to plan line by line, not for an integrated system. It's like building a jigsaw by starting off with a single piece and trying to construct or invent other pieces to fit in the hope that you can end up with a proper picture. It's exactly the wrong way around. And in the time that it took Nottingham to build the 2 lines that it delivered, the company that was doing the tram design, they'd actually built a whole city network in Porto. So all of this is doable, but on a scale that has to begin by thinking on a different level. Now, I was just intrigued that when I looked at Nottingham back in the 1930s, it actually had a network of urban tram and trolleybus routes that covered the whole city, not just 2 routes, but that it was possible to do this in ways that delivered an integrated, coherent view of an urban transport system. And we could do that now in ways that are based on clean and sustainable energy, in precisely the ways in which we have done it in the past, but have seemed to have developed this inability to remember that visionary steps that were taken when civic leaders were able to plan whole city or greater urban networks of integrated provision. In Tokyo, they're doing exactly the same now with a tram network that is going to be based on 100% renewable energy. We could do this the same in networks that had solar panels, wind turbines, renewable energy generation, where the surpluses during daytime production would actually go into cross support for the energy required to run a renewable energy transport system. Coventry has done the same with their very light rail transport system, which they've just developed and which doesn't even require much of the overhead wiring, because they're running on smaller scale tram units and in which they are battery powered, and the batteries are then charged from renewable energy systems, so that there's much greater flexibility on the routes that they can use within the existing road network, and also much greater flexibility in terms of their accessing to renewable energy on a scale that is stored in the tram itself rather than in the system. And this takes you back to that connectedness with where and how you source the energy system from. The example of Freiburg in their Sonnenschiff solar city is one in which they produce 4 times the amount of energy that the neighborhood requires. and are able to put that back into the powering of other energy, clean energy systems that deliver the integrated transport systems as well. And in terms of new developments, the intriguing thing is that now planners in Germany are starting to ask developers, where are the access points to the tram systems in your new development? Forget commuter car opportunities. You have to plan in easy walkable access to clean energy tram systems that will be integrated into the development itself. So ease of movement on public transport networks becomes an integrated obligation in the way in which we plan the future. In a different way, Bristol did this with its biobus. And I have to say, this is a lovely one that always makes me chuckle. What they were able to do is to look at the biogas that is generated from the sewage that we produce. And they then developed a series of what they referred to as biobuses, which run through the communities, the neighborhoods where the sewage is collected from, and they power the gas is collected and cleaned up and used to fuel the biobus. It's interesting that the local authority refers to these as the biobus. The local communities tend to refer to it as the poo bus. And it always makes me chuckle that on the side of the buses themselves, you have this depiction of passengers sitting not on seats, but on toilets. And just to put a cherry on that cake, the council had the wit or wisdom to refer to this as the number 2 route. And so this is a really good example of taking something that begins as a problem, and by a whole series of leaps in creative thinking and creative doing, starts to turn that problem into a local and sustainable solution. And those are the innovative ideas, the creative ideas that we need to harness in the connectivity between cleanup processes and reprovisioning of the resources that underpin viable community lives and livelihoods. The same happens, as we've already gone through, in terms of food. The variability now, the unpredictability of the weather patterns that we are being subjected to, put food production severely at risk wherever you happen to be living. And we're going to have to start to look at the delivery of urban food systems that grow in situ what we have been accustomed to just assuming would be imported at lower or near zero cost. And the intriguing thing about this is that for the UK, part of our history has already developed that. During the Second World War, communities were producing 6 times as much food per hectare from within the cities as they were within the countryside. Now, there are 2 reasons for this. One was that most of the labor that went into agriculture at that time was also being commissioned to fight the war, but also that urban communities were given the freedom, or local authorities were given the freedoms to commandeer urban land to create allotments from which people were able to grow their own food. And the notion of digging for Britain became a part and parcel of the self-provision that was an integrated part of community and household survival during those turbulent times. And we have to think about how we re-provision our own mindsets to get through our own turbulent times. What it will also do in this notion of the 15-minute city is to put back into our mindsets the notion of locality and accountability. Communities that have places where people can meet in cafes and catch up with each other. They can have access to local shops, they can have access to local services. All of this not only creates an urban merry-go-round, which is a money-go-round, so that the way we spend our time and our money actually keeps other people in work and keeps the circularity of the wealth that we have within viable communities. But it also allows us to look at reprovision and reconsumption rather than a lifestyle based on consumption and throwaway the residues. How the circularity of products is to be part of that, a new economics can best be seen, I think, in places like Denmark, and Copenhagen has a fantastic approach, which is the whole way in which they are prioritizing the reuse, the repair of goods that can be repaired, the shift in taxation to support the development of local shops, and to ensure that, in a sense, those who are renting the buildings aren't sitting in a position where they continue to exploit and demand phenomenally high rents, which they did do throughout the pandemic. But instead, we socialize the notion of affordable rents in order to deliver accessible commerce and community lives. And I think this is the examples of how to do this can be found across Europe and across the industrial world. But also you have to recognize then that the tax systems that are needed to underpin this also follow suit. Sweden was a very good example, where the notion of returning end-of-life products to the point of production, actually, when they started to look at it, to send some of these products back to parts of the developing world where they had been produced, was not only phenomenally expensive, but there's no guarantee that they were either going to be disposed of or reprocessed in sustainable ways. And so what they did is to say, okay, well, let's shift. We'll have a substantial tax imposition on the import of new goods, but we will cut VAT on all repairs and services. And that way, it was an investment and encouragement of the reprovision of those local services, the reacquisition of skills needed to repair and repurpose, and the reconnection of people in the lines of accountability as to where goods are obtained from and where and how they can be restored and repaired. And that's part of this circularity, which the 15-minute city or the 20-minute neighborhood is all about democracy, inclusion, and accountability, not about the containment of societies in some sort of prison camp mentality. That notion of the myth is actually being used to stand in the way of everything that climate science tells us that we have to do, which is to cut our carbon emissions by 10% per year, every single year for the rest of this decade and probably the decade after. And to do that, we need a different economics and a different mindset. And that's the challenge that we all have to play our part in picking up and delivering. One part of this as an intriguing endpoint is the examples largely in Canada, which is the development of distribution networks that are branded under the heading of not Amazon. And what that says is actually we can coordinate the distribution of goods across a wide spectrum of the types of goods that are being purchased, but they don't need to be on the depersonalized, highly automated and human time managed processes that Amazon subjects its workers to. You can have local distribution networks that are not Amazon. And actually, the more we do that collectively, the more we begin to tie our ropes together. And that's going to be the key to getting ourselves out of this mess. There's a lovely tale that I remember Tony Benn used to tell, which is about the child who falls down the well in the village and is okay, but can't get out, and the calls for help, and the villagers gather around and they are looking down the well, trying to reach some. John shouts, get the ropes, get a rope. So they lower the ropes down. Each person brings one. One is 20 foot too short, another is 15 foot, another 10. So they all get tantalizingly close, but none of them actually reach the child. And the voice from the bottom of the well shouts up, tie your ropes together. And that is exactly what we have to do now in the notion of how we produce, store, distribute, and repair in localities where actually providing sustainable communities and sustainable economies is also compatible with a sustainable environment in which we can survive. That's the challenge.